Welcome to Make Things That Matter, the podcast where we explore impactful products and the cultures that create them. I'm your host, Andrew Scottsko, and if I'm doing my job well, each episode of this show will help you to do meaningful work, make things that make things better, and have a great experience doing it. Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Make Things That Matter. This podcast explores how to express your creative potential in the world and do it on your own terms. Each episode of this show will help you to learn, create, collaborate, and lead better to make things that matter to you and have a great time while you're doing it. This episode flips the script a bit because in this one, I'm actually being interviewed. Now, I've heard from a number of listeners who have written in. By the way, thank you for doing that. I love hearing from people. Please email me or hit me on Twitter. Follow the links in the show notes. Now, I've heard from a number of listeners saying they want to hear more of my thinking. They want to get to know me better, not just hear that of the thinking of my guests. So I thought it'd be fun to share this conversation where I really open up in a way that I probably haven't shared on this podcast before. Now, in this conversation, I was interviewed by Philip Kasumu of Founders Pledge. If you're not familiar with Founders Pledge, it's a community of entrepreneurs who are passionate about combining entrepreneurship, social impact, and philanthropy to do good in the world. It's a terrific community that I'm proud to be a member of. Now, the way it works is that pledgers commit a portion of their personal exit proceeds from their company to charitable causes, and then Founders Pledge helps facilitate the whole process after that, whether that's with research, with guidance, with helping you figure out which causes you want to support, as well as all the logistical stuff. In short, they made it very easy, and it was actually a really rewarding and fulfilling experience that I learned a lot about myself through. So I really enjoyed it. And this was an interesting interview that Philip asked me to do where I actually shared, and he really dug into some of my own journey, some of my mental models, a lot of the worldview that shapes how I think at a pretty fundamental level. So I wanted to share this and kind of open the kimono a little bit. That hopefully will help you get to know me a little bit better after this conversation. If you are curious and you'd like to learn more about Founders Pledge or join the community, which I totally recommend, please follow the links in show notes or go to founderspledge.com. They are wonderful to work with. So with all that, I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it.
So, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Philip, it's a pleasure. What an honor. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Andrew, for those who don't know who you are and what you've been up to over the last few years, can you please just give us a brief introduction? I read your 28-second intro on your site. So let's see if you can do that in real life.
You know, it's funny. I should go reread that because I don't think I've looked at that page in a minute. Let me go look at it. Okay, good. That page is a little bit out of date. I should update it, and I should probably have a more concise answer to this question. But yeah, I'm a podcaster. I'm a product leader, an entrepreneur. I live in Los Angeles, but really consider myself a citizen of the world and feel really connected to cultures from all over the place. So in terms of, how I like to spend my time, I spend my time I love building teams and working with people to push the boundaries of what's possible and try to create something that matters together. That's really what I spend my time thinking about.
I'm happy to tell you that you've actually shaved 3 seconds off your intro. So it's actually...
All right.
So you can actually go onto your website and update and say me in 25 seconds. Anyway.
Okay, perfect. I will fix that right after this.
Cool. So look, I really want to talk to you about kind of like your entrepreneurial journey and then delve into a bit more around your philanthropic journey and how that's going and why you even have a philanthropic journey. But before we get into that, let's talk about you. So you are a product leader, podcaster, entrepreneur, philanthropist. What would you say defines you the most?
I would say none of those words define me the most. I would say the thing that defines me the most is actually my curiosity. I think if I were to, I'm reminded right now of something I heard Simon Sinek, who I'm a huge fan of, something I heard him talk about a few different places where he talks about, my roles, the roles that I play, they do not define me. I'm not defined by what I do. I'm defined by who I am. And who I am is I'm a curious optimist, and I'm defined by curiosity and empathy. I'm also really into like Buddhist philosophy, and they talk a lot about compassion as sort of a natural impulse that arises when you encounter suffering in the world or something that can be better. And I just think that for me is actually kind of what's behind the scenes running things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I saw your little your Buddhist quote on your site too. Eat me if you wish.
Oh yeah, it's a classic Buddhist parable, the Saint Milarepa. Yeah.
What does it mean?
It's basically a short parable of a Buddhist saint named Milarepa who in this story, he basically he leaves this cave that he's in and he comes back and his cave is totally full of demons. Like there's demons all over his cave. He's like, what the hell? And he's got to try to get rid of them. And he's running around like a crazy man, trying to get rid of all these demons, and it's not working. And basically the harder he tries to make the things that trouble him go away, the more they stay put. And so he basically has to change his approach. And one by one, I won't spoil the punchline of the story. Anyone who's still interested should go read it. But one by one, he solves it. And then he solves this problem by basically confronting the truth that he didn't want to look at. So I think it's really for me, it's a story about, seeking and finding and facing truth wherever it might be, especially the inconvenient places.
Yeah, totally. So, technology, that's your bread and butter. Like we said, you're a product manager now, but you kind of started off in the engineering space, right? So you started off as an engineer in your career. Is that correct?
Actually, there's a step before that. I actually started my career in marketing. So I went to school originally for engineering, didn't find a version of engineering I liked. I hadn't really come across computer science at that time. And so I ended up actually starting my career in marketing. And a couple of years into it, I was working at a startup. Excuse me. I was working at a startup and pivoted my career like on the job and switched back to engineering. And basically, this is sort of before there was all the before there was all like the coding boot camps and stuff. And I just went into a cave and basically became an engineer on the job. I kind of had no life for about a year, but, I switched on the job and I ended up doing engineering for quite a few years after that. And before, then after a few years of that, I kind of realized that I think I was a good engineer. I didn't think I knew what it would take to become a great engineer. And I thought it wasn't really like what, I think we have to be honest with ourselves about like, am I willing to do the work to become great at something? And the honest answer was no in that domain. And I personally resonated a lot more with the craft of product management and product leadership as this sort of intersectional thing between technology and design and business and people. And it just felt that felt like home, much more to me. So that's actually how I ended up. That was sort of my winding path to it.
Yeah. And then I guess after, the engineering career, or I guess working within that company and doing marketing and whatnot, you actually wanted to go on and create your own company, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, totally.
So that was that Peterbridge?
Yeah, that was Peterbridge. So I think I wouldn't say that I was like that kid who was, had the entrepreneurial streak and was like starting businesses when they were 7 or whatever. I think it's a great story, but I don't think it's representative of most people's stories. I didn't come into, interest in entrepreneurship and starting things until, much later than 7 years old. But by the time I was in my 20s, that was solidly something I was very, very interested in. And, it's a long journey, but yeah, that was Peterbridge, which is still going on today. I started that with a friend of mine, and we basically saw this opportunity to, bring a sort of a technical innovation to a different ecosystem. It was like we saw this happening in one technical ecosystem, but it didn't exist in this other technical ecosystem. So we said, we think there's an opportunity to build this kind of software and these kind of tools for developers over here. And so, we pursued that one, pretty aggressively. And that was a bootstrap company. So all the stuff I'd done before that was funded. That was the first time I'd ever, taken a crack at bootstrapping something.
Wow. That's awesome. So what did you guys do? How did it, you talked about how you and your friend kind of came up with this idea and let's like do this thing over there. What did you guys do and how did it grow?
Yeah. So my co-founder in that was Aaron Stannard, who still runs the company today. And I actually want to give credit. Peterbridge was really more Aaron's idea than mine. We had been friends. We'd been looking at stuff together, and we just would, we'd go have dinner and beers and all this stuff. And, he had seen this idea. He kept talking about this one open source toolkit called Akka. And Akka is it's a framework, for what's called middleware, which is basically a behind the scenes type of software that the way it was being used was to help people create really, really scalable, dynamic infrastructure for their applications. So think about the way I always explained it was like, imagine you're Netflix. And I actually don't know if Netflix uses Akka, but it's a decent example. So if you're Netflix, you have your servers get hit with load every night at prime time, whether it's like wherever it's 7 PM in the world, because that's always moving around the world, wherever that is, Netflix has servers that are just absolutely getting smashed. And that's great because they need to do that. But to actually handle that on the back end, like with your servers and with your technical infrastructure, to have something that can be really flexible, that can scale up when it needs to and scale down when it needs to, and then, transfer scale to other places, that gets really, really complicated, and it's hard to do well. And it's hard to build these distributed applications. And so this had been pretty well addressed in the Java ecosystem. And then Aaron and I saw this opportunity to bring the kinds of innovations that were happening in that ecosystem to the .NET ecosystem, which is basically the Microsoft ecosystem, everything that's written in C#, the .NET framework, et cetera. And so we basically said, we think there's an opportunity here for a company to be the leader of open source software in this space. So it was the idea of taking it was an open source software company. So we were the primary, and Petabridge still is the primary driver and sponsor of the Akka.NET open source project. And that's on GitHub. Anybody can go look at it right now. And then the business models in open source software are really different than most. You end up having this, it gets really complicated, but one thing I loved about the business models there is that you could kind of help everybody at whatever level of support made sense for them, right? If people didn't have any money or any funding, they could just use the open source tools and the community tools. Like we spent a huge amount of our time. I spent all of my time basically on evangelism and community, and we built a really strong international community. Or there's higher levels of premium or paid support where, companies want a support line they can call. They want, certified builds of the software, things like that, or training and things like that. So we sort of had this multi-layered business model, which is a little more complicated than like a straight, I make this and you buy it. It just gets a little more complicated than that. But it's an interesting way to do business because you end up kind of being able to help when you can figure it out. You can end up being able to help a lot of different people at whatever level makes sense for them.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Which I really liked.
Yeah. I think the open source community has always been quite interesting to me because it's like, hey, there's this business model where you can give everything away for free and help millions of developers all over the world, some of which may never pay you, but then the
most of which will never pay you.
Yeah. So it's always been interesting. I guess for you guys, did that model work out? Like, did it make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think when you ask the question of like, does this model make sense? You have to look at that from a bunch of perspectives. Like there's the model as it relates to the product you're making and the customer you're trying to serve, but there's also like, well, what kind of company are you trying to build? And that's something that I think people don't spend enough time thinking about. I certainly at that point hadn't spent enough time thinking about what kind of company did I want to build. I was still very much programmed by my background in the venture-backed world, right? Which is fine, but it's a very particular, like if you're going to do a VC-backed startup, that's a really particular beast. And it makes total sense in certain types of scenarios and certain types of conditions. And most things are not that. Even though most people like VC startups and everything, like all the Silicon Valley stuff, that gets most of the hype. It takes up the lion's share of media that we consume, as it relates to technology and startups and whatnot. But if you look at the actual numbers of like businesses in the world, it's not the majority. And there's an extraordinary there's like a huge range of possibilities of kinds of businesses you can build that are somewhere between like, oh, my little side project that does nothing, and it's $1 billion unicorn. Like I reject the implicit frame that Silicon Valley sort of drives, which is it's billions or bust. And that's just not true. It's true if you're playing that game. Yeah. If you're going to play that game, you got to play it that way, but that's not the only game in town.
Yeah, no, 100%. I actually recently just read a book not too long ago, and it literally spoke about most of the biggest failures in tech or in business do come from like the tech companies trying to swing for the fences, whereas actually there's this huge space in the middle for just growing really good businesses that generate, millions of dollars, and don't require VC funding, and are, good cash flow businesses and profitable as well.
Oh, 100%. And I think we all got kind of programmed, like we also got sort of negative conditioning around those ideas from all the media around Silicon Valley. And a lot of people who wanted to build that kind of business where they're like, hey, I want to, I want to build a company, but I want to have a life too. Like I'd like to be sane and have a startup. They sort of got, okay, wait, can I cuss on this podcast? I forgot to ask you.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. They sort of got shit on, right? Like people were made to feel like they were lesser than for wanting that. And that like the only true option for an entrepreneur was like the Silicon Valley unicorn thing. And it's just not true. And I'm really happy that in the last couple of years, there's a lot more opportunities, and a lot more people like broadening out the space that entrepreneurs can play in, right? Look at, my own podcast. I just interviewed, we were talking about this before we hit record. Like I just interviewed Rob Walling, who's, and Rob is probably one of the best known people out there advocating for this middle way. Look at what he's doing with Tiny Seed or, the last 10 years of everything he's done with Microconf and startups for the rest of us. And, Rob is a really good example of that, but he's not the only one. Like he's a figurehead of a large community. And so there's a lot there for people. There's a lot of interesting space to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess talking about kind of like the whole tech startup, and playing that game, you actually did a stint at a couple of companies that I guess did subscribe to that way of living. Mm-hmm. You spent some time at a company called Chill, which was acquired by Tinder, and then Pebble, the famous wearable watch that got acquired by Fitbit. So while you were at both of those companies, we can start off with Chill. What was your experience like there? And I guess were you there through to the acquisition stage as well?
Yeah. So those were really, really different experiences. So Chill was where I switched from marketing to engineering. So before it was Chill, it was something called Namesake, which most people never saw, don't know existed, but that was actually what birthed the whole the Chill. And Chill was this crazy ride over a few years. Like the amount of new versions of the product we went through, was pretty crazy. And so, Chill was one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. The culture we had, the team we had, I'm still really good friends with a lot of those people, even though it's been almost a decade. And like the people, like, man, what a team we had at Chill. And it was like, we could turn around a whole new product faster than some people could turn around like a new feature. And it just really was credit to the team, to the leadership. It was just an extraordinary culture. I remember how things changed when we got the funding, the large amount of funding, the Series A. Before that, we'd had angel funding, and then we sort of hit this big inflection point right around the time that I don't know if you remember, maybe your listeners do. Facebook had this thing called Open Graph. It was in like I think it was 2012, and this was like right when Pinterest was blowing up for the first time. And a lot of companies got their user bases exploded really, really fast on the back of this Open Graph protocol that Facebook was testing out. But then Facebook kind of changed their minds, as well as a lot of the consumers of these apps. They weren't really that interested. So the retention numbers for a lot of companies who were building their user bases on these, it looked like everybody was getting traction, and they were in one sense, but it wasn't like good traction. The retention numbers and the quality of these user cohorts was really not a good fit. And so if you were looking at the numbers, if you were looking carefully, you could see the problem developing before it was obvious. But ended up being an extraordinary experience. Unfortunately, and I still don't know the full details here, and I don't want to speculate too much without real good information. But anyways, I ended up leaving a little while before the Tinder acquisition. So it was sometime the year after I left that the Tinder acquired it, and then all the folks who I worked with kind of helped guide Tinder's rise into what Tinder is now. Brian and Dan, and Scott and Mike and a whole bunch of people, behind the scenes. So it really was an extraordinary team that deeply, deeply understood the dynamics and the mechanisms of social software. Yeah,
no, that sounds fascinating. And I guess your role there as a you left before you said the acquisition, but you were the software engineer there. But I can imagine that being a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, were you part created Tappy? Was it Tappy that you guys created?
By no means was I the only software engineer. I was a software engineer on an extraordinary team. That team of engineers was probably the best I've ever worked with. And I was so fortunate to the patience they showed me and the coaching and everything. They were the people who incubated me shifting from marketing to engineering. So extraordinary team. Probably the best I've ever worked with. And so, yeah, after I left, we ended up they ended up shutting down Chill, and then kind of taking a lot of the infrastructure that had been built and starting to experiment with Tappy, which was sort of a mobile social video thing. Tinder, acquired it a fairly short time afterwards. I don't remember exactly how long, but I think it was within a year, that Tinder acquired it. And then, yeah, pretty quickly thereafter, I started working on Pebble, which was a whole other crazy rocket ship.
Yeah, that's a whole nother beast. I mean, I watched the whole Pebble thing explode. Did they start off as a Kickstarter campaign?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pebble was as far as I know, Pebble was like the first mega Kickstarter campaign. I mean, I think their first Kickstarter was like 10 million or something.
Yeah, it was insane. I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah, up until then, nobody had seen anything like it. I think the biggest before that was like maybe 1 million or less than 1 million. And then all of a sudden there's this smartwatch that I think it was like $10.3 million or something. I'd have to look it up. And yeah, that that was funny. Like if you look at the history of Pebble, and my history is rusty here. I haven't thought about this in a while, but after YC, Eric Mijakovsky, the founder, had a really hard time raising funding, and the Kickstarter was almost like a last ditch thing. But by the time I got involved with Pebble, it had sort of shifted into like hyper growth mode, and so that was my first time really being in I guess you would, what's the phrase everybody loves now, like blitz scaling or something. Basically, a startup that's just growing so damn fast.
Yeah, I can imagine. How long were you there for? And what kind of the main roles that you had at that organization? Yeah,
I worked with Pebble for, I don't remember exactly how long it was. It was about 1.5 years. And at the time I was helping with a lot of the back end software. So I didn't actually work on like the watch. That was the first time I'd ever worked on anything or worked around anything hardware. So I didn't do anything that had I didn't touch the firmware or anything like that. I was working on a lot of the systems engineering and the software that helped run the business. So like a lot of the e-commerce software, the stuff that was helping the user experience scale. And that was led by a friend of mine, Ben, who brought me into Pebble. But yeah, I didn't actually, we worked with the firmware folks sometimes, but I didn't actually touch the firmware. But I think the most interesting thing for me about Pebble was I don't think I'd been in that experience before. Like with Chill, we'd had the product growing very, very aggressively. There was a period of time there where, our user base was doubling so quickly. Like it just destroyed every single one of our technical scaling plans. Our CTO, Dan, had to keep every week he was throwing out the plan and starting over. But Pebble was really different because the organization was scaling and, it was just growing really, really quickly. And that's just a whole other kind of chaos that I had never been around before. It just organizationally and the people and understanding who people are and how do you get things done. And that's a whole thing unto itself, that I guess has been studied a lot more now by folks who wrote that book, Blitzscaling? I can't remember.
But Reid Hoffman.
Yes. A man who certainly knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, that's incredible. And then, so you've had, like we said before the show, you've had quite an interesting career path. I always find, career paths like yours probably the most interesting because you've just touched so many different things. We haven't even spoken about kind of your time as an EIR, at PhD Ventures or your time at 500 Startups and just really tasting everything. And so it kind of brings you to where you are now as a product lead, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a bit of a winding path. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk to us about your role at the moment and where you are right now.
Yeah, for sure. So after Petabridge, basically by the end of, okay, got it. So, basically in 2016, I was looking to sort of make a trajectory shift. And I think this is where my involvement with Founders Pledge probably began. I don't remember exactly when I got involved with Founders Pledge, but it was probably somewhere around here. And at that time, I ended up going to a place that has become quite controversial, called Singularity University, or SU for short. And I did this program called the GSP, the Global Solutions Program, which is basically this I think of it as like nerd summer camp for adults, where you basically we had like 80 folks from all over the world, huge range of disciplines, from technical people to product people to artists to activists, scientists, this wide range of people. And basically your job for like the whole summer was you would just have this access to all these really interesting people and like the cutting edge trends and data and labs and all this stuff. And your mandate was like, think about problems and how you could use technology to solve problems, that affect 1 billion people or more, which is just such a radically different way of thinking. And, SU, for all of the controversy around it, has done truly an amazing thing. They've basically incepted the world over the last 10 years with the messages of abundance and technical abundance and like all the stuff around like the fourth industrial revolution that's now at the, like Davos and everything. Like SU, for all of its problems, has incubated an incredible message and a pretty incredible community of people. And so anyways, how I got to where I am now, what I do now, for the last couple of years, I've been leading a lot of product efforts at a place called Applied Invention, which is a multidisciplinary innovation company. You can kind of think of it like, if you're familiar with the term skunkworks, it's kind of like a skunkworks where it's like an outsourced skunkworks, where basically we team up with large companies and entrepreneurs and try to solve really, really hard unsolved problems where if you could solve it, like these are problems where it's less of like a market risk problem, but more of a product or a technical risk problem. I'm not going to go, it's not as far as like cancer, like, cancer, if you solve cancer, there's a market. It's not that far, but it's more along the lines of like, we know there's a market for this, but no one's figured out how to do it technically. And, that's where Applied Invention is really, really good. And so we have this incredible multidisciplinary team of, all sorts of people under one roof, from scientists to designers and engineers and mathematicians and physicists and biologists and like all just crazy combination of people. And we'll team up and do these. It's almost like a joint venture where we'll go after some really unsolved problem that we think would, if you could solve it, would, not only be good for the world, but like there would be a business there. And we do that with these partners, when those partners sometimes are big corporates, sometimes they're entrepreneurs. And so, I've been working there with an incredible group of folks for the last couple of years. And, I've worked on quite a few different things when I've been there. The main one that I worked on, and this goes back to my time at SU, I got really interested in my time at SU in kind of two big things looking forward to the future. The first was the way I language it is the intersection of human and environmental systems. So basically, where do human systems overlap with the environment? How do we make that overlap, like that interface? How do we make that a good interface? Especially relevant there. So that's, things around climate change and the food system, in particular there. And so I was especially interested in the food system as it related to the ocean. And the other broad thing that came out of that, which is what I'm starting to explore a lot more of now, is really like the future of work, right? So you think about whether it's through vehicles of economic empowerment or changing people's engagement in their jobs. Like those are the sort of the two broad interests that I developed starting a couple of years ago. Was one, how do we have good human systems that are regenerative or enlivening with natural systems? And then secondly, just how do we create human systems that are regenerative and enlivening to people? And so I've spent the last few years mostly working on the first of those. And now I'm starting to think a lot more about the second.
Awesome. And I love how, I guess, your day job, if you will, as a product manager really ties into the way you think about philanthropy, right? And what you care about. And that's where I guess I want to switch gears and kind of talk a bit about philanthropy and I guess, Founders Pledge and how you got involved with that. So can you tell us a bit about your personal giving journey and when and how did it start? And I guess why?
Yeah, great question. I guess the why goes back to kind of where we started this conversation. It's like that sense of, I was going to say empathy again, but that feels a little bit trite right now. I would say it's a sense of connection. Like I grew up differently than a lot of people. Like if you look at me, you'll see a cisgender hetero white guy. And you might assume like I grew up in some normal, typical way, but I kind of grew up in what I think is a fairly atypical way where my parents both worked for the US government. And so, I was basically a military brat. So I grew up, a lot of my formative years were outside the United States. Like my first memory, is in Chad in Central Africa. I was like, that's my first memory. I came online, at whatever, like 3 years old, walking down a street in Central Africa. And the reason I say that, and the reason I think that's relevant, is because I think for me, it kind of goes all the way back to like, I've never known what life was like not being connected to the world. Like some people grew up on the same street with the same, few friends around them for like 15 years and went through all schools together and that whole thing. And that's cool. And frankly, part of me probably envies that, but I never really had that experience. I always was, I was always connected, always felt connected to the many ways of living life on this planet. Like, there's not one way to do things. And so I think for me, that's the why. And that's where it comes from. In terms of how I think about it now, I would say, to get deep about it for a second, like for me, it comes, I'm going to reference Simon Sinek again, but like for me, it does come back to that underlying reason why. Like for me, everything is about exploring what's possible so that, people can flourish and bring their unique contributions into the world to make their little corner of the world a little bit better, a little bit brighter. Because I believe that every single person's ideas matter, their experience matters. And so anything that hits on those ideas is going to resonate with me. And so to come back around to your question, I think that giving gets too narrow of a definition. I think giving, we usually hear that and we think about giving money, which is great and it's important. And, 100% people should learn about things like effective altruism and all of that. But I think a larger resource that we all have to give that doesn't get enough attention is our time and our energy. What do you get up and do tomorrow? And what's the impact of that? How do you feel about that? And that's where, I'll give another shout out to an organization I'm a big fan of called 80,000 Hours, which is really about how do you use your career for positive impact. So anyways, for me, I think it comes back to that way of growing up. I grew up in a very mission driven family. And so it's always been normal for me that work and mission and giving, if you want to use that word, like those have always been connected. It's not something that like my worldview was never that you bolted it on later. It was always there from day one.
No, I think that's super important as well. It should be more of a lifestyle, right? As opposed to this one-off activity that you engaging every now and again.
I think so.
And I guess what kind of challenges have you faced when you first, or did you face rather, when you first embarked on this journey of like, I want to give, or I want to do something more than just live my standard life? Yeah,
thanks for the question. I think it's a great question. I think the biggest challenge that I faced, and I don't know if this one ever goes away. I part of me hopes it does, but I have a feeling it doesn't. But the hardest thing for me was figuring out what I really cared about. I think we are certainly, well, I won't generalize that. I'll speak for myself. I was strongly conditioned that I should care about XYZ. I should care about this. I should care about that. And I think in our society, or at least the way I grew up, there's a lot of that. And I think it's really, really hard. There's so much noise. There's so many different interests and people and belief systems telling you what you quote unquote should do. And there's not enough space for connecting with what you actually want to do and actually care about. And so for me, it's that was really the journey. And I think that journey for me is still going on, is, figuring out, cause it changes, right? Like I think I used to think, oh man, I'm going to solve this once. Like back when I went to SU, I was like, cool, I'm going to work really hard this summer and I'm going to figure out all the stuff I care about. And that's it. And I'm going to be, I'm cooked. I got it. And that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. But I don't think it works that way. Nothing is static. Everything's impermanent. Everything's changing. And turns out that's true with the things we care about too. So it's, I think the hard part has been allowing myself the space to explore my own interest, to truly indulge my curiosity and not to feel guilty about it. I think it's something I really struggled with for a long time. And it's something I still struggle with, honestly, is really, connecting with which pieces of this matter to me. What do I want to contribute? As opposed to what does somebody else tell me I should?
Right. Absolutely. And I guess that makes a lot of sense as to why I guess you would want to have joined Founders Pledge, right? So you joined, like you mentioned, back in 2016. And you kind of touched on this already, kind of like your key motivations for giving. But I guess what were some of your key motivations for, I guess, taking the pledge, and what have you learned so far along that journey? Because I know you mentioned kind of like 80,000 hours, which actually, funny enough, another interview I did today with another one of our members, he mentioned that when he was kind of going down on his journey and thinking about how can he, I guess, remove the fuzziness of giving and actually be a lot more practical with his giving as well, right?
Yeah.
How, talk to me a bit about taking the pledge and what you've kind of learned so far on this journey.
Yeah, for sure. So quick, just really, and I will answer that, but a quick aside for the 80,000 hours thing, 100% people should check that out. Amazing resource for sharpening your thinking about how to create impact with your career. One thing I will say is that their framework, what's so great about the framework is that they have one and it's principled and it's opinionated. I think where it does go a little bit, it's a little bit clinical, and that's a criticism that people make of, that's a criticism people make of people make of EA as well, is it's like too clinical and there's no space for, your subjective experience. But, I just think as long as you take it with a grain of salt and use it as a tool and not a gospel or a dogma, you'll be fine. Now to come back around to your question of like, well, what have I learned on this? I think what motivated me is all the things we're talking about. Right. Like, I don't think it's one thing, but like when I came across it, it just made sense. I was like, oh, cool. Like, if I am able to create a successful outcome of any scale, like whether that successful outcome is like a tiny exit or some big exit, like pre-pledging and saying like, yeah, I want to have, it just made sense to me as an extension of like, I'm already spending my time and energy trying to use everything I can bring to bear to make parts of the world better and make something I care about better. Why wouldn't I want the outcome of that work to also do that? So to me, it just sort of felt obvious, right? Of like, I feel like if you're someone who believes in the kinds of things I'm talking about here, about using your time and your energy this way, to spend your time making contributions and making things that matter, then it just makes sense to me that like, if that's your worldview, that you would also want the outcome of your efforts to similarly have added knock-on effects, right? Like, I only have so much time. And that's actually the beautiful thing. That's the beautiful thing about giving money and being able to like create financial wealth to give away as well, is like, it can do, it can be a replacement for time in a sense. Like, it can be a multiplier. It can go where I can't go because I only have so many hours in the day, just like everybody else. I think I have a mind that loves frameworks, right? I love principles, frameworks, ways of looking at things. And with that, I love trying to figure out like how a system works, what makes it tick, et cetera. But the reality is that there's no one right answer here. I think that's maybe the biggest thing. I tried to approach giving and a lot of these subjective questions too much like an engineer and not enough like a designer, right? Engineering problems, when you try to, a lot of times engineering problems have like, there is a right answer. And then there's design problems where there's a lot of right answers. And I would say giving is a design problem. There's a lot of ways to do it. There's a lot of right answers. And I think it's finding the mix of approaches and causes, et cetera, that work for you, that have you excited, and wanting to keep doing it. And I would say, so that's one lesson. I would say the biggest other lesson I've had, and this goes in the realm of thinking about career. I definitely, this hopefully makes sense given everything I said about like the way I was raised and all that. I think a place that everybody trying to make the world better with their time does a disservice is we think the mission will conquer all. We treat it like, or at least I'll speak for myself. I certainly used to approach things like, it doesn't matter how much it doesn't matter how much fun I have doing this. It's important, right? It's important. It needs to be done. We're going to get it done. And that very like almost military mission driven sort of mindset. And there's some utility there for sure. But what I realized is that, that's a recipe for martyrdom, and martyrdom is not a good look, and it doesn't sustainably make the world better. So I think it's really, really important to find pathways for giving and making the world better that you actually enjoy walking, right? Like, if you don't enjoy the path you're on, you're not going to be able to sustain it. Like, maybe you can grind it out for a couple of years, but for the long haul, for like the decades it takes to truly change things in the world, there's no way. You're just not going to do it. And that's something I learned the hard way by burning out, was that no matter how noble, I'm using good in sort of air quotes, but like in this sort of moral purest sense, right? This sort of noble aspiration that we aspire to, no matter how good that was, if I wasn't fundamentally enjoying the activities I was doing in pursuit of that goal, and I wasn't enjoying the people I was around, it just wouldn't matter. Like at the end of the day, I would burn out. I wouldn't be able to go the distance, and I wouldn't be able to actually make the contribution I was hoping to make. So I think those would be the two big lessons. There's no right answer. There's no one way, and you have to find a way to enjoy the ride. As cliche as that is, my own direct, as I know this is so cliche, but if you just look at it like literally, what do you spend all your time doing? Who are you doing it with? And then what's it pointed at? And if you don't feel, it takes all three. You can't just feel good about what it's pointed at. You need to feel good about literally what you spend your time doing and who you spend it around, or you'll never get to the thing you're pointed at.
Good points. Good points. And I guess, talking about the things that you want to do, and how you spend your time and energy and resources, what cause areas do you care about the most? Like, what are you most passionate about?
Yeah, I would say my passions, like I was saying earlier, they have shifted. They are shifting. Maybe they always will be. I don't know. But I think I've spent a lot of my time in the last several years, last 3.5, 4 years, really focused on the environmental side of things. Like we were talking about, especially in the ocean. And I still care about that a lot. I've spent a lot of energy and time thinking about the ocean, how we make it better, fish farming, ocean science and sensing, et cetera. Those are active areas of work that I've been involved in and still am. I'd say the things that are the new passions that are firing me up lately are much more on the human systems. I'm really, really interested in how do we build a better future of work for people. I'm really, really interested in the future of organizations and the role they play in creating a more fully alive world, right? I think organizations are where we live our lives. They're where we spend our time. And I think they're like the key lever for shifting the quality, not only of people's experience, but also all the second and third order effects that organizations create. So I'm really interested in the future of people's experience in organizations and how those organizations are vehicles for people's development, their expression, and and having a positive impact on every stakeholder that they come into contact with. So I'm really, those are the things I'm nerding out on a lot these days. And that's why I started a podcast and a lot of that sort of thing.
Yeah, totally. And I guess you have in the past donated to the Iodine Global Network, which is, I guess, one of our recommended charities in education reports. Can you tell us a little bit about, why you did that, why you chose to support them, and a little bit about their work as well?
Yeah. So I'm definitely not a deep expert on their work, and I'll refer people to, we could link to some better resources in show notes, but I would say the process, this was actually something that I found really valuable. So, a few minutes ago, I said that one of the hardest things about going on this journey is figuring out what do you want to support, whether it's financially or with your time, your energy, whatever. I had such a great experience actually working with the deployment team at Founders Pledge. We did, I think it's called, remind me, I'm forgetting. It's a values discovery conversation. Is that what it is?
Yeah, the value discovery process.
Yes, the value discovery process. Thank you. So I went through that, and it was, basically this really intense conversation for a couple hours, talking about all sorts of crazy scenarios and values. And I won't spoil it for people, but it was a really, really interesting experience. And it just, out of that experience, it became obvious that this was that was a great way to support the things I care about. I really care about economic empowerment. I care about the environment. I care about, health and nutrition, education. And that was one example where it just makes so much sense, because you're like, okay, wow, this is a high leverage opportunity, right? I can give something here that is it's proven to be effective. It impacts multiple cause areas. And it's a well-run organization, right? And so kind of putting a little bit of that, I think you have a little bit of that balance of, there's the subjective side of figuring out what do you care about? And then I think once you sort of bound the world and scope things in a little bit from there, then putting on the EA or the effective altruism hat is really great. Cause then you're saying, okay, cool. I've decided where I want to play. Now, how do I play? Who do I support, et cetera? And as we went through that process, that just seemed like it just popped out as a great candidate, It's not the only one, but it's a fantastic one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess, working and looking towards wrapping up now, the work that you've done with the IGN and the work that we do with IGN is obviously remarkable. And like you said, it's one of the many areas you could focus your energies. And I think that's actually kind of one of the hardest things about philanthropy, about charity in general. There are so many different players, like you said, how you decide. I guess obviously with the work that we do here, we try and help you make that decision as much as possible. So looking like wrapping up now, obviously it's been a very, very turbulent year. So
yeah, that's putting it lightly.
I think we're going through some turbulence now. I mean, we're still waiting for the elections and whatnot to wrap up. So I guess to end on a bit of a positive note, I'd like to ask you one thing that you are most optimistic about. Like, what are you looking forward to? We're at the tail end of 2020. We're going into 2021. What are you looking forward to?
Yeah, thanks for that. Despite being kind of a dumpster fire of a year by a lot of measures and a really hard year for all sorts of people, I'm reminded, like, in really hard times, I'm reminded of the beautiful side of human nature. When I look at what people's responses are to the hardship, and that's like, of course, there's conflict, and conflict is a natural thing. It can be healthy. It's not inherently bad, but I'm reminded, I just look around and I see their best instincts coming out sometimes. Sometimes it's hidden. You have to look for it, but it's there. And I 2020, if anything, has taught us that control is an illusion. And now we've all had a direct experience of that for most of the year. That's probably a good thing, I think. And I'm looking forward to seeing people en masse, hopefully, start to live more according to their values. Like, I've had a lot of conversations with people this year, friends, acquaintances, etc. And this, I think, for a lot of people has been the first time that they've really taken stock, that they've really had the chance, the time to kind of be still, to contemplate. The world is so frenetic by default now. And a lot of people don't have any practices in their life, any habits around contemplation. And this has sort of forced it on them. And I think that's a really good thing, actually. And so high level, despite a dumpster fire of a year, man, I think that long term, a lot of good things are going to come out of the reflection that has been forced upon humanity this year. And I think we're going to see that in big ways. And I think we're going to see it in small ways. Like, there's never going to be a day again that I take for granted being able to hug somebody. I love dinner parties. I will never again take a dinner party with people I care about for granted, right? Like, that sense of community, of connection. I think when things go really sideways, like they have this year, you're forced to really reflect on what's important to you. And, then inevitably you end up back at the place of like, okay, so what do I do different tomorrow? And I think having basically all of humanity forced to confront that question, despite it being kind of painful, I think net will end up being a really good thing.
Awesome.
But like I said, I'm an optimist.
Yeah. And on that note, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show. If people want to get in contact with you to learn more about your podcast, the things you're doing in your current role, where can they find you? So you can reach out to me. I run a podcast that's called Make Things That Matter. That's probably obvious by now why I care about that, but the show's called Make Things That Matter. We talk about a lot of these questions that we've been exploring here about, how do we make things that matter? How do we use our time, our energies well to make products and companies and organizations that all the things we were talking about. So check out the show. It's makethingsthatmatter.com. Just all spelled out. And you can email me there at andrew@makethingsthatmatter.com. Or hit me up on Twitter. I'd love to hear from anybody who thought this was interesting, wants to talk more. I really enjoy that. So please do reach out. And I love to help anybody. If I can be helpful to anybody on their journey, I would absolutely love to. So please do take that as an actual open invitation. Awesome, Andrew. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely, Philip. My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. My honor. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, I'd be so grateful if you could do me a favor and take about 25 seconds to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. That helps me reach way more listeners, and it also helps me bring you more great guests. As always, please feel free to reach out to me anytime at connect@makethingsthatmatter.com. And until next time, my friends, leave them better than you found them. See you out there.